What if the one person who could save your child's life was someone you helped years ago when you had nothing? This is not a coincidence. This is not a movie. This actually happened. And by the end of this video, you are going to question everything you ever believed about kindness, fate, and why doing good for strangers sometimes comes back in ways that will completely break you. Let's go back to 1987, Memphis, Tennessee. A woman named Carol Hayes is standing in a hospital parking lot at 11 at night, still in her nurse scrubs, eating a cold sandwich because she didn't have time for a real lunch or dinner. Carol is 34 years old. She has a 9-year-old son named Danny at home being watched by her neighbor, an old woman named Mrs. Patterson, who never charged her a single dollar because she said, "Honey, you're doing God's work, just go." Carol was not rich. She was barely making it. She worked the morning shift at Memphis General, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then 3 days a week she picked up evening shifts at a private clinic across town just to cover rent and groceries. Her husband had left 4 years earlier. No child support, no goodbye, just an empty closet and a note that said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." So Carol did what strong people do. She kept going. She was the kind of nurse who remembered patients' names weeks after they left. The kind who would sit with an elderly patient during a scary procedure just so they wouldn't feel alone. The staff loved her. The patients loved her more. But love doesn't pay bills, and Carol knew that better than anyone. Now here's where the story really starts. One Tuesday morning in October 1987, Carol comes into the hospital and finds out there's a man in the emergency room with no insurance, no ID, and no family. His name, they would later find out, was James Whitfield. He was 22 years old, originally from rural Alabama, and he had collapsed on a Memphis street with a ruptured appendix. If they didn't operate within hours, he would die. Simple as that. The hospital administrator called it a financial liability. That's the actual term they used. A human being with a clock ticking inside him, a financial liability. The surgery would cost $4,200. James had $11 in his wallet. Carol was not even supposed to be involved in this case. She was just walking past the administrator's office when she heard them talking about discharging him to county, which basically meant sending him somewhere else and hoping for the best, which with a ruptured appendix meant hoping for a miracle. She stopped walking. She went back to that office door and she said, "What does he need?" They told her $4,200. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Give me a few days." Now, Carol had $1,800 in her savings. That was everything. Her emergency fund. Her what if Danny gets sick money. Her what if the car breaks down money. She had built that over 2 years of double shifts and skipping things. She wanted new shoes, a weekend trip, a winter coat that actually kept her warm. She went to her bank that afternoon and took out $1,800. Then she went to 3 of her closest co-workers and told them what was happening. 2 of them gave her $200 each. 1 gave her $300. She was still like $500 short. So Carol Hayes did something that took more courage than most people will ever understand. She went to her own mother, a retired school teacher, living on a fixed pension in a small apartment, and she explained the situation. Her mother listened without saying a word. Then she got up, went to her bedroom, came back with an envelope and handed it over. Inside was $2,500, every dollar of it. Her mother said, "You didn't get that kindness from strangers. Carol, you got it from me. Now go use it." Carol walked back into that hospital with $4,200 in cash. James Whitfield had his surgery that same evening. He survived. When James woke up, Carol was sitting in a chair by his bed. Not because it was her job, because her shift had ended 2 hours before. She was just there. She had brought him a cup of Jell-O and a small cup of orange juice from the break room. When he opened his eyes and saw her, he was confused. He didn't know what had happened. He didn't know who had paid for anything. She just smiled and said, "You're okay. You had surgery." "How do you feel?" he said, "Like I got hit by a truck." She laughed. He laughed. And then he asked, "Who are you?" She said, "I'm Carol. I'm a nurse here." He said, Did someone pay for my surgery?" The doctor said someone paid. Carol just shrugged. Don't worry about it. Just get better. She never told him it was her. James stayed in the hospital for 6 days. During that time, Carol checked on him every single day, even on her days off. She brought him books from the small hospital library, mostly old thrillers, because that's what was available. She talked to him. She found out he had come to Memphis, looking for work after losing his job at a furniture factory back in Alabama. He had no family left to speak of. His parents had passed, no siblings. On the day he was discharged, he stood in the hospital lobby and he looked at Carol and he said, "I don't know how to repay whoever helped me. I don't even know who it was. But I swear to you, I'm going to spend the rest of my life being worth it." Carol just nodded. She went back to her shift. She never expected to see James Whitfield again. She went back to her double shifts, back to cold sandwiches in parking lots, back to Danny's school pickups and Mrs. Patterson's warm apartment, and trying to figure out how to rebuild that $4,200 she had just spent on a stranger. Life went on. Danny grew up. He was a bright kid, funny, curious, always asking questions. Carol would tell him stories from the hospital because he loved them. He used to say he wanted to be a doctor someday. Carol would smile and say, "Then you're going to study harder than you've ever studied in your life." He did, but here's the part nobody tells you about raising a child, alone on a nurse's salary while trying to be everything to everyone. You run out, not just money. You run out of energy. You run out of the invisible thing inside you that keeps pushing you forward. By the time Danny was 17, Carol had started having health problems of her own. Headaches that wouldn't go away. Fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. She ignored it for almost a year because she couldn't afford to be sick, emotionally or financially. When she finally went to the doctor in 1996, they found a tumor. Not small, not early stage. A brain tumor, sitting in a place that made the surgeon very quiet when he came in to talk to her. The kind of quiet that tells you everything before the words even come. He said the surgery was possible, but it was high risk. The tumor was near the brainstem. It required a specialist, a neurosurgeon, with very specific training in that exact type of procedure. There were maybe 4 or 5 surgeons in the entire country who he would trust with a case like this. The nearest one was in Nashville. His name was Dr. James Whitfield. Carol didn't make the connection at first. Whitfield is not the most uncommon name. She just heard Nashville specialist neurosurgeon and started doing the math on how she was going to get there and who was going to take care of Danny while she was gone. It was Danny who found the connection. He was looking up the surgeon online. This was early internet, so it took him a while, and he found a small article in a Nashville medical journal about Dr. James Whitfield, who had grown up in Alabama, worked in Memphis in his 20s, and had put himself through college, and then medical school after what he described as a life-changing experience with a stranger's kindness that made me understand what medicine is actually supposed to be for. Danny read that paragraph 3 times. Then he went to his mother and said, "Mom, I think this is the man you helped." Carol read it. She put the paper down. She picked it up again. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "It doesn't matter. He's the best surgeon. That's why we're going." They drove to Nashville on a Thursday morning. Carol, Danny, and Mrs. Patterson, who was 79 years old by then, and absolutely refused to be left behind. When Carol sat down in Dr. Whitfield's office, he came in reviewing her file. Tall man, calm eyes, the kind of doctor who makes you feel like your problem is the only problem in the world right now. He sat down, looked at her chart, looked at her, and stopped. He said, "Memphis General, you worked at Memphis General." She said, "For 20 years, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 1987, October, I came in with a ruptured appendix. I had no insurance. Someone paid for my surgery and never told me who they were. The nurses said it was someone on staff. He looked at her steadily. I've thought about that person almost every day for 9 years. I went to medical school because of that person. Carol didn't say anything. He leaned forward slightly and said very quietly, "Was it you?" And Carol, this woman who had worked double shifts for 20 years, raised a son alone, given away her entire savings for a stranger. Never asked for anything back, just nodded once. James Whitfield, one of the finest neurosurgeons in the country, sat back in his chair. And he cried. Not a polite tear, actually cried, right there in his own office. This accomplished, serious, respected doctor put his face in his hands and cried like someone who had just found something they had been looking for a very long time. Then he looked up and said, "I'm going to take care of you. I want you to know that, whatever it takes." The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, Danny watched his mother prepare with the same quiet strength she had always shown. She organized her paperwork. She made sure Danny knew where everything was. She called Mrs. Patterson every night. She didn't cry in front of anyone. But Danny heard her one night, very late, sitting in the kitchen by herself. Not sobbing, just crying softly, the way people do when they think no one is listening. He went and sat next to her and didn't say anything. She put her arm around him. They sat like that for a long time. The morning of the surgery, Dr. Whitfield came to see Carol before she went in. He sat next to her bed and he said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "Okay." He said, "When I was lying in that hospital bed in 1987 and I found out someone had paid for everything, I made a promise. I promised that whoever that person was, if I ever found them, I would spend the rest of my career being worth what they did. I went to school on that promise. I operated on my first patient thinking about that promise. I'm going to operate on you with everything I have. Not because you're my patient, because you're the reason I'm a doctor." Carol looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "James, you were always going to be a doctor. I just made sure you were still alive to become one." He smiled. Then he stood up and he did his job. The surgery lasted 9 hours. Danny sat in that waiting room for 9 hours. Mrs. Patterson sat next to him, holding his hand for most of it. At some point she fell asleep in the chair, and Danny didn't move because he didn't want to wake her. When Dr. Whitfield came out, he was still in his scrubs. He looked tired in the way that people look after they've given everything they have to something. He walked toward Danny, and Danny stood up so fast he almost knocked over the chair. Dr. Whitfield said, "She's out." She did great. We got it all. Danny put his hands over his face. Mrs. Patterson woke up, looked at Dr. Whitfield, and said, "Well, it's about time." Carol recovered. It took months, real recovery, slow and frustrating, full of bad days and small victories. Dr. Whitfield checked on her personally throughout the entire process. He called, he visited. He sent Danny his personal number and said, "Call me if anything feels off." Any time, day or night. Danny did call once at 2 a.m. because Carol had a headache that scared him. Dr. Whitfield answered on the second ring. Carol went on to live another 23 years after that surgery. She went back to nursing part-time after her recovery. She never stopped. Mrs. Patterson lived to 91 and said her secret was minding my own business and minding Carol's business. Those two things kept me busy enough. Danny Hayes became a doctor, a pediatrician actually. He works at a children's hospital in Memphis. He chose pediatrics, he says, because his mother taught him that the most important patient is the one in front of you right now. He has a photo in his office. It's from the late 1990s. Carol and James Whitfield standing together outside. Nashville Medical Center. Carol still in her patient gown, James still in his scrubs. Both of them smiling in the slightly dazed way of people who have just been through something enormous together. Underneath the photo, Danny wrote 4 words on a small piece of tape. "This is why, always." Here is the thing about Carol Hayes that I want you to sit with before you close this video. She did not give that $4,200 because she had extra money. She gave it because she couldn't walk away. She did not know it would come back to her. She did not do it expecting anything. She did it at 2 o'clock in the morning of her own savings, with a 9-year-old son at home and a husband who had already walked out on her. She did it because she was the kind of person who stops walking when she hears something wrong down the hallway. That's it. That's the whole thing. And 20 years later, that same quality, that stopping, that turning around, that refusal to keep walking, came back and sat next to her bed the night before the most terrifying morning of her life. It came back with a medical degree and 9 hours of the steadiest hands in Tennessee. You cannot plan that. You cannot manufacture it. You can only be the kind of person who stops when they hear something wrong and trust that the world is quietly keeping track. Carol Hayes never asked for anything. The world gave her everything anyway. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it with one person who needs to hear it today. And watch the next video already on your screen. You're not going to want to miss it.